One of the strangest quirks of Marlene Dietrich, aside from her impeccable style and irresistible charisma, was her almost obsessive fondness for penicillin. Whenever a friend fell ill, she would insist on this miraculous cure, prescribing it as if it were a panacea for every ailment. Yet no one suspected that her bond with penicillin had nothing to do with hospital memories of recovery. The truth was that Alexander Fleming, the modest English genius who had discovered the healing properties of green mold, was secretly the great actress's lover. It was the most unusual affair of her stormy life, and perhaps her greatest secret. From her youth, Marlene, ever perceptive and curious, had felt an inexplicable attraction to men of science. Someone had once convinced her that they made the most remarkable lovers. The reasoning was simple and alluring. Being so utterly absorbed in their work, they paid no attention to other women. Yet to the one they loved, they gave themselves over with an almost unthinkable, concentrated passion, never wasting themselves on petty flings. Her close friend, and for a time lover, the celebrated writer Erich Maria Remarque, often confirmed this theory, claiming that his own brother, a physicist, was a far better man than he was, more profound, more focused. In 1949, while Marlene Dietrich was in London filming Alfred Hitchcock's psychological thriller Stage Fright, her longtime friends, the famous composer Misha Spoliansky and his wife Elsa, offered to arrange a fateful introduction. They wanted to present her to one of these consumed by science types, Alexander Fleming, who had recently been knighted by the British Queen and granted the title of Sir for his revolutionary discovery. In London, Marlene had her own circle of acquaintances, among them Dr. Hindle, known for his work in treating yellow fever. He was to be the chief matchmaker, bringing Sir Fleming to dinner at the Spolianskys' home. On one condition, Marlene would take charge of the meal. Dietrich, practically simmering with anticipation at the thought of meeting this famous and mysterious recluse, in whom she imagined untamed passions smoldering, initially refused, protesting that she was a poor cook. Of course, this was pure coquettishness. "Enough with the modesty," the Spolianskys replied in chorus. Anyone who had ever tasted her dishes knew that Marlene was a superb cook, something of a Sarah Bernhardt when it came to stuffed cabbage and other home-style triumphs. There was no turning back. Marlene promptly cabled Remarque in New York to consult him about the wine selection, since it was universally known that no greater connoisseur existed. What concerned her was that, according to the Spolianskys, Fleming was a devoted wine lover. Remarque's reply came swiftly, topped with a sly postscript so typical of him: "Just don't start kissing the man you've gone to all this trouble for right after dessert. Wait until the lights go out." It was a jest, but also perhaps a bit of friendly advice. On the eve of meeting Fleming, Dietrich, claiming ill health, a rarity for her, even canceled the filming of a crucial scene in which her character was to be killed, and threw herself entirely into the kitchen. Ah, the agonies of culinary creation! They bordered on torture, for the actress's signature dish was scrambled eggs, something she prepared only for those deemed worthy of staying the night. And since this was to be her very first meeting with Fleming, who knew how events would unfold? In the end, she settled on goulash. For 4 hours, Marlene worked the meat to perfect tenderness, as though preparing for the most important battle of her life. Exactly at 8 o'clock, Fleming arrived at the Spolianskys' home, accompanied by Dr. Hindle. As they stepped into the hallway, Hindle quickly whispered to Marlene, whose face betrayed her tension. "Please, whatever you do, don't talk to Fleming about penicillin. He can't stand hearing about it." A light starter and aperitif were served. Marlene sat in silence, staring at her plate, trying to hide her excitement and awkwardness. The Spolianskis exchanged glances, attempting to smooth over the dragging pause and puzzled by the strange behavior of their star guest. And just as Fleming opened his mouth to ask Marlene to pass the salad, she suddenly blurted out, sharp and bright, as if fate itself had teased her into it. "And don't you start talking to me about movies. They're terribly boring." It was her way of taking revenge on him for her own anticipation and nervousness. Fleming froze, extreme surprise written on his face. Marlene had expected him to praise her cooking, but the scientist seemed completely indifferent to the meal, entirely absorbed in some private train of thought. Dr. Hindle, however, attacked dish after dish with such an appetite that one might have thought he'd been starving for days, making up for the reserve of everyone else at the table. At the end of the dinner, Marlene, solemnly, almost ceremoniously, uncorked a bottle of wine recommended by Remarque. To her astonishment, Fleming looked utterly bewildered. It turned out he never drank at all. "How is that possible?" Elsa exclaimed. "Everyone says you can't live without a bottle." "And what do you take me for? An alcoholic?" Fleming replied, more perplexed than offended. The Spolianskis chuckled quietly, enjoying the resolution of this little comedy of manners. And so, on this grand note, dinner came to an end. The happiest of all was Dr. Hindle, who, stroking his well-fed belly, struggled up from the table full of both food and impressions. As for Fleming, on rising from his chair, he stumbled and, like a schoolboy, stepped on the hem of Dietrich's dress. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" The scientist blushed crimson, something Marlene did not fail to notice. But before she could reply, Madame Spolianskaya slipped on a banana peel, such a ridiculously cinematic detail, and fell with a scream. She had broken her leg. They had to lay her out on the carpet in place of a stretcher and carry her all the way to the waiting ambulance. "Most important, don't you dare give your wife penicillin," Marlene told Misha with a wry smile, having resigned herself to the fact that any hope of romance seemed to have evaporated. To her surprise, this cynical quip made Fleming burst out laughing. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small packet, speaking with almost boyish pride. "This is the only gift I could think of for you. My very first culture of synthesized penicillin." Marlene was taken aback. But I was told you're allergic to penicillin." "Who told you that, Dr. Hindle?" Fleming's tone grew serious. "He's never forgiven me for making the discovery. We started working on it together, and that's why any talk of penicillin makes him seethe with jealousy and resentment." "Why don't we get out of here?" Marlene suddenly suggested, feeling strangely drawn to his eccentricity. And so, like a pair of runaway schoolchildren, they quietly slipped out of the Spolianskis' home. Fleming walked her all the way to her hotel. They laughed over the absurd moments of the evening, and that shared amusement became the first brick in their unusual relationship. Fleming even confessed that he liked her very much. She was pleased, but also intrigued, sensing a challenge. The only trouble was that her new suitor's appearance was absolutely unacceptable to her tastes. He wore some outdated high-buttoned frock coat, as though unaware that fashion or elegance existed at all. Marlene decided she would reform him. The next day, they met again, and thus began their romance. Strange, yet deep. Every morning, before heading to his laboratory, Fleming would leave fresh flowers at her door with a short note, usually nothing more than a comment about the weather or some scientific observation. And Marlene, gripped by curiosity and a desire to understand this extraordinary man, went to the British Library and read everything she could find about Fleming, immersing herself in the world of science so utterly foreign to her. They grew fond of walking at night, hand in hand, along the Thames embankment. Alexander spoke of nothing but penicillin, his voice brimming with enthusiasm and inspiration, his cheeks flushed. He sometimes stammered with excitement and looked at Marlene with a pleading gaze, searching for understanding and approval. She took this, of course, as a sign of a love beginning to burn, pure, unstoppable. Yet it never went further than these innocent symptoms, as though his mind were entirely consumed by a single, all-encompassing idea. Marlene, unused to waiting, decided to take the first step. It ended in long kisses and embraces. From then on, she set herself to the task of transforming Alexander. She taught him to dress with more ease, choosing for him new, modern suits, took him to royal ballet performances to nurture his taste for art, introduced him to horseback riding, and even persuaded him, on several occasions, to skip meetings of the scientific society, disrupting his rigid schedule. Fleming proved an apt pupil, delighting in the discovery of this new, more worldly life, as if opening the door to an entirely unexplored realm. Then Marlene began to notice that her suitor's eyes were wandering toward other women. Having turned a stiff academic into a Don Juan, she had no desire to let the fruits of her enlightenment fall into a rival's hands. Before long, she suspected that Fleming had taken a liking to one of the dancers in the Royal Ballet Troupe, whose talent he had singled out for praise. Worse, he had lately taken to disappearing, ignoring their rendezvous. He would make plans to meet her at the cinema, then fail to appear. Marlene would wait for him in her car at the theater entrance, gnawed by doubt and jealousy, only for him to call later with apologies, arrange another meeting, and again not turn up. Marlene Dietrich, a woman to whom men were drawn without effort, was jealous. It was not her way to chase after a man, especially one so easily distracted. The insulted star was prepared to resign herself to yet another failure in love, if not for one maddening but. Fleming had once again begun appearing in public in his old, tightly buttoned black frock coat, as though reverting to his former self. Oh, what on earth has happened to him? She wondered, her heart tightening with a sense of foreboding. What is that woman doing to him? The horror. All her work, all her effort to re-educate him, undone by some brazen interloper. For the first and only time in her life, Marlene decided to break her own rules. She called Fleming, told him she could not live without him, and arranged an evening meeting. Naturally, he did not come. Driven by despair, she rushed to the Royal Opera House, where the ballerina was employed. Fleming was not there either. The simplest way to find his home address was through his laboratory. Marlene arrived, walked down an empty corridor where the air smelled of chemicals, and suddenly heard Fleming's voice from behind a door, urgent, excited. Peeking through a narrow crack, she saw Sir Alexander standing in the corner, speaking passionately toward the far side of the room. The narrow opening kept her from seeing his companion. A rush of blood to her head. Alexander was without a jacket, his shirt partly unbuttoned, as if in the midst of some heated scene. Good God, she thought. He's brought the ballerina to the laboratory to make love to her right there on the table, among the reagents. She wanted to turn away at once, to keep her dignity intact, but decided she had to see the woman who had crossed her path and destroyed her work. She pushed the door open wider. There was no one else in the room, unless one counted the flask of penicillin on the table before him, the true object of his passionate, almost fevered speech. He was musing aloud about the formula of an organic compound, its properties and its potential, as though declaring himself to the first and deepest love of his life. Marlene understood everything. Sir Alexander Fleming was indeed a Don Juan, but only in one sense. The object of his ardor, alas, was not women. He had transferred all his passion to science, to his research. There, he was utterly happy, wholly consumed by his creation. In his illusory world, he had found the perfect mistress, one who never demanded attention and always answered his devotion with fresh discoveries. God, why am I not mold? She whispered it, closed the door, and tiptoed away like a shadow, feeling the bitterness of defeat and the full depth of her mistake. A few days later, Hitchcock's filming wrapped, and Marlene had to return to Hollywood. She didn't call Fleming. There was no point. He too made no effort to reach out, absorbed once more in his true passion. Just before her departure, as Marlene was about to leave the hotel, the bellboy handed her a small parcel. She glanced at the return address, and her heart skipped a beat. With a tremor of anticipation, she unwrapped it. Inside lay a pink box of penicillin, the very same sample of the first synthesized culture of mold with which their acquaintance and her illusions had begun. "This is the best I can give you," the brief note read. Had someone brought her the severed head of the ballerina rival, she would have been satisfied, seeing it as a sign of reconciliation and victory. But here was the rival in her entirety, in all her undeniable, formidable glory, and she had won. From then on, Marlene spoke only of the patients saved by Sir Fleming, and never of the scientist himself, as if trying to erase him from her personal history. From America, for a time, Marlene sent Fleming packages of food. Post-war England was gripped by hunger, and this was her way of showing care from afar. Later, she learned that Fleming had married, though she never sought to find out to whom, unwilling to invite fresh pain. Later still, it became known that his wife had died young, leaving the scientist alone for the rest of his life, wholly devoted to his work. "The fate of all great people is that they must be alone," Marlene concluded, drawing a line under both her own life and her understanding of genius. And for posterity, in her memoirs, she wrote, "They put up monuments for everyone now, even pop singers. I haven't yet seen a monument to Alexander Fleming. Perhaps there will be one somewhere. That would be good." And so ended this extraordinary romance between a Hollywood icon and a scientific genius, where passion yielded to purpose and love for a person gave way to an unshakable devotion to one's calling.